In a city of a million stories, hers was about to become a legend. Taxi horns cried from somewhere far below, and the air buzzed with the mingled scents of rain and champagne. But her eyes weren't on the bump. The crowd behind her murmured with delight. Men in tailored tuxedos leaned closer to women in backless dresses. Champagne flutes clinked, and a string quartet played something soft and romantic. Her mind was fixed on one image far below in the gold-lit ballroom of the Grand Atoria Hotel. Even from this distance, she could picture the smug curve of his mouth. The way his hand would rest just a little too tightly on Clarissa Hayes's hip as if she were a trophy he'd won. Clarissa, the same woman who used to be his mistress, while Isabella ironed his shirts and pretended not to notice the lipstick stains on his collars. She could still remember the first time she saw them together in public. Across the room, Adrian had been laughing with Clarissa, who wore a gold gown so tight it looked like it had been poured onto her body. Clarissa had looked over, given Isabella one slow, appraising glance, and turned back to whisper something in Adrian's ear. That was Clarissa, always making sure Isabella knew her place. And now, tonight, that same mistress had become the wife. They think the show is for them. He was dressed in black. She glanced sideways at him, catching the faintest smirk on his lips. The timing, the angle from this rooftop, even the color scheme of the fireworks. Up here, this is your night. Every burst of light out there is a reminder of what you've built for yourself. And yet, when she saw the invitation to his wedding reception tonight, complete with a rooftop fireworks finale, it had felt like a punch to the gut. He was giving her dream to someone else. And she wasn't alone. She'd been at home sketching designs for the Singapore resort project they'd been working on together when her phone lit up. Be in Manhattan on the 17th, he'd said without preamble. A wedding you're not invited to, Daniel replied. And a rooftop party you are invited to. Mine. The idea of being in the same building as Adrian and Clarissa made her stomach churn. But Daniel had a way of making the impossible sound inevitable. Below, she could just make out the faint sound of cheers from the ballroom terrace. She wondered if Adrian had seen her yet. If in some stolen moment between the toasts and the cake cutting, he'd glanced up toward the rooftop and spotted her silhouette against the exploding sky. Let them look up. She exhaled, a breath she felt like she'd been holding for an entire year. The wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of the string quartet below, the scent of expensive perfume, the distant hum of a city that never slept. Up here, under the open sky, she knew the truth. She hadn't lost a thing worth keeping. A massive golden willow that seemed to pour molten light over the rooftops, bathing everything in a warm glow. And Adrian Carter could choke on his champagne. Before the fireworks, before the rooftop, before the billionaire at her side, Isabella Ross had been someone else entirely. She used to be the kind of woman people described as nice. Nice smile, nice manners, nice enough to fade into the background of her own life. At 30 years old, she could pass through a crowded room without a ripple. She grew up on the south side of Boston in a narrow row house that smelled of laundry detergent and her mother's pot roast. They didn't have much money, but they had stability. She was smart, creative, and obsessed with buildings. How they looked, how they felt, how they seemed to hold stories in their walls. By the time she was 15, she was sketching floor plans in the margins of her math notebook. It was in New York during her second year that she met Adrian Carter. Adrian had the kind of charm that could convince you to change your mind before you even realized you'd made a decision. He noticed her in the campus library one rainy afternoon. "Is that the Chrysler Building?" he'd asked, leaning against the table with a smile that could melt concrete. "It's inspired by it," she'd replied without looking up. He laughed, and somehow, by the end of that conversation, she'd agreed to have coffee with him. From there, it was a whirlwind. Not just the straight-A student or the future architect, but her. Her parents were skeptical. "You barely know him," her mother warned. He needed her to host client dinners, travel with him to conferences, and keep their new apartment looking like a magazine spread. She liked creating a home, liked being the steady half of a rising power couple. Adrian was affectionate, ambitious, and generous, at least when things were going his way. But as his career skyrocketed, so did his ego. Adrian introduced her as one of our PR assistants, and Clarissa gave Isabella a smile so sweet it made her teeth ache. Months later, she found Clarissa's earring in the back seat of Adrian's car. Adrian denied everything, accused her of being paranoid, and turned the conversation into an attack on her lack of understanding about his job. By their 7th anniversary, Isabella's life had shrunk to the walls of their penthouse apartment and a carefully curated image she maintained for his colleagues. She had stopped sketching, stopped dreaming, stopped seeing herself as anything but Adrian's wife. It wasn't planned, but the news lit something inside her. She imagined Adrian holding their baby, imagined late nights in the nursery, imagined a future that might fix the present. For a brief moment, she thought the pregnancy might bring them back together. She was wrong. When she suggested joining him, he said she needed to focus on resting. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done. But she had something Adrian had long forgotten, her own identity. And then Daniel Layton reappeared in her life. She'd met him years earlier at a design conference in Singapore back when she was still with Adrian. At the time, she'd laughed it off, flattered, but not taking him seriously. She was pregnant, still raw from the divorce, and unsure she was ready to step back into the world she'd left. Daniel didn't push. "You don't have to prove anything to me," he'd said. She took the job. Working again felt like breathing after being underwater for too long. She was Isabella Ross, architect, designer, soon-to-be mother, and a woman who had built something of her own. The Grand Atoria Hotel was the kind of place that had no quiet corners. Perched on the edge of Central Park, it was a century-old landmark that had hosted presidents, movie stars, and royalty. Its marble lobby stretched high enough to hold the sound of 100 conversations at once. Bellmen in crisp uniforms glided past, their movement so smooth it was almost like choreography. Fine china edged with platinum, gold-plated cutlery, and crystal stemware that caught the light like prisms. Isabella had been in that ballroom before. Back then, she'd thought the Grand Atoria was magical. Now she knew better. Magic, she'd learned, was only ever an illusion. Tonight, the ballroom was a stage, and Adrian, as always, was playing the lead role. He stood near the center, hand on Clarissa's waist, his tuxedo tailored to perfection. Clarissa's gown was a deep liquid red, slit high enough to make older women raise their eyebrows and younger women take notes. Every move she made was deliberate. From the tilt of her chin to the way she leaned into Adrian's side when the photographer circled. From the rooftop terrace above, Isabella could see them through the glass. The way Clarissa's fingers traced lazy patterns on his lapel. And while it didn't have the head count of the ballroom below, it outclassed it in every way that mattered. The crowd here was smaller but sharper. Venture capitalists in understated Italian suits, gallery owners in sleek black dresses, and a smattering of celebrities who preferred conversation to camera flashes. Waiters moved silently between the guests, offering canapés that looked like miniature works of art. From here, the fireworks would look like they were exploding over them, and that was the point. Isabella's silver gown shimmered under the terrace lights, catching more than one admiring glance from guests. She moved easily among them, answering questions about the Singapore resort project. Listening as people spoke about architecture like it was the new art form of the decade. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't there to be someone's plus one. She could see the flash of cameras as the official photographer circled the happy couple. And somewhere in that carefully curated glow, she imagined Clarissa looking perfect and knowing it. He smiled. "I stopped being subtle the day I left him." Down below, a small commotion caught her eye. Servers wheeling in a towering wedding cake, 5 tiers of white fondant and sugar roses. Now she knew the cake was just another prop. The rooftop air shifted, the music softened, and Isabella realized the fireworks were about to start. From here, the display would appear to crown the city itself, each explosion painting the skyline in colors no architect could ever replicate. Heads tilted upward, glasses paused mid-toast. The ballroom's massive windows reflected the burst of silver light, but from the way Adrienne's posture stiffened, she knew he wasn't looking at the fireworks. He was looking higher, straight at her. The terrace lights framed her like a portrait. And Isabella knew which one she belonged to. Down below, Clarissa turned to follow Adrienne's gaze. And it had, because tonight wasn't just about fireworks, it was about altitude. And Isabella Ross was finally standing where she belonged, above it all. If Isabella's life had a turning point, it wasn't the divorce papers. When they first met, that ambition had been magnetic. He had a sharp mind for numbers, a quick tongue for persuasion, and a confidence that filled any room he entered. But ambition, unchecked, has a way of eating the person who carries it. By the time they'd been married 5 years, Adrienne wasn't just climbing the corporate ladder. And he didn't care who he stepped on to get there. He knew when to flatter, when to undercut, when to leak a rumor to the right person at the right time. And then there was Clarissa Hayes. Bright, blinding, and destructive in ways that could burn down everything in her path. What she lacked in experience, she made up for in strategy. She had a way of locking eyes with someone and making them feel like the only person in the room. Those gestures were deliberate breadcrumbs leading her targets exactly where she wanted them. She started requesting to be assigned to his accounts. She found reasons to bump into him in the lobby before work and lingered near his office after hours. If she couldn't get his attention during the day, she made sure to show up at the same bars he and his colleagues frequented at night. Isabella noticed. Of course, she noticed. The later nights, the new aftershave, the sudden interest in expensive cufflinks he never used to care about. When she brought it up, Adrienne brushed her off. Don't be ridiculous. She was calculating. And when she finally sank her claws into Adrienne, she didn't just want him. She wanted his life. It wasn't enough to be the other woman. That meant pushing Isabella out, but doing it in a way that made Adrienne think it was his idea. She started planting seeds, little comments about how tired Isabella looked lately, how it must be so hard for her to keep up with his career demands. You could do better. The moment Clarissa realized Isabella was pregnant, she doubled down. It was a threat. A child meant a lifelong tie between Adrienne and Isabella. A bond that even divorce couldn't erase. Clarissa couldn't have that. She began whispering about how some women used babies to trap men. Adrienne never repeated those words to Isabella, but she didn't need him to. She saw them in the way his eyes darted away when she talked about the baby's future. She heard them in the silence that followed her excitement about picking out a crib. I need someone who can keep up with me, not drag me down. From that moment, Isabella stopped pretending she didn't know. She started paying attention, not just to what they did, but to how they operated. Adrienne's weakness was his ego. Clarissa's was her hunger. Together, they were dangerous, but they were also predictable. She learned that Adrienne's wedding to Clarissa wasn't just about love or lust. It was a business move. By marrying her, Adrienne was doubling his influence. Clarissa, in turn, was securing her place at the table she'd been eyeing for years. They weren't just building a marriage, they were building an empire. And like all empires, it needed an audience. They wanted to be seen. If Clarissa had been the match that lit the fire, Adrienne had been the gasoline. But what neither of them understood was that Isabella had learned from both of them. She'd watched Adrienne network and manipulate. She'd watched Clarissa plot and execute. And somewhere in the rubble of her old life, she'd gathered those lessons and built something new. She didn't need to confront them in the ballroom. She didn't need to make a scene. And they would. Isabella had been underestimated before. She doubted it would happen again. It started with a sound, not loud, not dramatic, just the faint, unmistakable clink of glass on glass. Isabella heard it even above the hum of rooftop conversation. She didn't have to see it to picture the scene. The ballroom lights burned bright enough to make the city outside fade into darkness, turning the people inside into moving silhouettes. "They're about to make their big moment," Daniel murmured beside her, his voice low but steady. She didn't answer. This was the kind of event she used to plan for Adrian, the kind she had poured hours into, making sure every detail was perfect. In the ballroom, Adrian began speaking. He was a practiced speaker, a man who could tell you he was ruining your life and make it sound like a favor. The guests laughed at the right moments, lifted their glasses when prompted. Then it happened. Clarissa turned her head just enough to follow Adrienne's gaze, and that gaze was pointed upward, directly at Isabella. Even from a distance, Isabella saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Surprise first, then something sharper. Confusion, maybe even irritation. He hadn't expected her here. Elegant, poised, a silver gown draped over her growing belly like liquid moonlight. First a few, then more. Heads tilted upward, curious. A murmur rolled through the ballroom like a wave hitting shore. Someone near the glass pointed toward the terrace above. Isabella didn't move. The wind caught the loose tendrils of her hair, the terrace light catching the diamonds at her ears. She was a portrait framed in glass and sky. Daniel, of course, understood the moment. From the ballroom, the energy shifted. Waiters hovered uncertainly with bottles of champagne, unsure if they should keep pouring. The music stuttered before picking up again, but the rhythm of the night had cracked. Adrian was still talking, but fewer people were listening. It was a small fracture, barely visible unless you knew where to look. A moment when her control had cracked, when the humiliation had been hers. She'd gone there alone, hoping to distract herself with her favorite risotto. Instead, she'd walked straight into Adrian and Clarissa, seated at a corner table with his parents. Adrian hadn't even stood up. Now, as the rooftop crowd pressed closer to the railing for the fireworks, Isabella felt the shift in her bones. The first firework burst overhead. A white chrysanthemum that lit the sky and reflected off the glass between them. The two of them framed by fire and sky. She didn't need to say a word. The picture spoke for itself. Adrienne's eyes were locked on her now, his expression unreadable from this distance, but she could imagine the thoughts racing behind it. Why was she here? Why was she with Daniel Layton? Why did she look like that? Whatever spell she'd cast on the ballroom was broken, and she knew it. You don't have to do anything. Just let them wonder. The second firework exploded, red and gold this time, painting the terrace in warm light. She already knew she'd made her point. Adrienne's shoulders were tight, his jaw set. Clarissa was still smiling for the cameras, but it looked brittle, like glass about to crack. Daniel caught her eye and gave the faintest nod, as if to say, "It's done." In the weeks after she left the penthouse, Isabella moved like a ghost through her own life. It was nothing like the glass and steel palace she'd once called home. The crown moldings were chipped, the radiator hissed in the night, and the hallway smelled faintly of someone else's cooking, but it was hers. No security guards at the door. No elevator ride to the 32nd floor where neighbors smiled too politely, but never really looked at you. And yet, for all its freedom, the place felt unbearably empty. Even his absence had a shape, a hollow in the mattress where he used to lie, a space in the closet where his suits had hung. But grief has a way of lying to you in your own voice. The pregnancy magnified everything. A baby was supposed to be a joyful thing, but joy was hard to find when you were eating dinner alone most nights, staring at the single-place setting you'd bothered to put out. Her days had no rhythm. She tried to fill them, answering a few freelance architecture consultations, running errands, folding and refolding the tiny clothes she'd bought for the baby. But there were hours when she would just sit on the couch staring at the muted TV, unable to summon the will to move. Milk, bread, prenatal vitamins, and as she was waiting in line, she heard laughter from the next aisle over. She didn't recognize the voice at first. Clarissa. She couldn't see her, but she could hear the bright, tinkling laugh, the one she'd once heard at the company holiday party when Clarissa was just a PR assistant. The laugh was followed by Adrienne's voice, low but warm in a way it hadn't been with Isabella for years. Her heart thudded in her ears. For a second, she considered leaving her cart right there and slipping out the side door. Adrienne looked immaculate as always. Clarissa was wearing a cream sweater dress and a smug little smile that deepened when she spotted Isabella. "Oh, hi," Clarissa said as if they'd bumped into each other at a casual brunch. 2 sentences, over in less than a minute. She cried until she could barely see, the steering wheel slick under her hands. Not really. She was crying for the version of herself that had once believed she could keep him, that her love and loyalty would be enough to compete with his hunger for something shinier. She stopped checking the news. She didn't even notice the letter at first. It had been slid under her apartment door. "I hear you're too good to be forgotten. Let's talk." It took her a full hour to realize who it was. She almost didn't call. But something about the note stuck with her. When she finally dialed, Daniel answered on the second ring. "I was starting to think you wouldn't call," he said, his tone amused. "I wasn't sure you meant it," she admitted. "I don't write things I don't mean. Meet me for lunch tomorrow, and before you say no, yes, I know you're pregnant. Yes, I have a driver. And yes, the food will be worth it." She almost laughed, and the sound startled her. It had been so long since she'd heard her own voice lighten. The next day, she met him at a quiet corner table in an art-filled restaurant she'd never have found on her own. "A resort in Singapore, modern, sustainable, a statement piece, and I want you to design it." She blinked. "You want me?" "I've been following your work, even the small projects." "You haven't lost it." Her throat tightened. "You're pregnant, not broken," he said simply. That night, she lay awake in her little apartment, the portfolio open on the coffee table. For the first time in months, she felt the stirrings of something she thought she'd lost entirely. Purpose. The next morning, she called Daniel. And just like that, the slow, gray descent she'd been living in began to shift. It wasn't a leap to the top. It wasn't fireworks, but it was a step. When Isabella agreed to take the Singapore resort project, she thought she was just taking a job. His name was synonymous with architectural audacity. He was a billionaire developer with an empire that spanned 5 continents. The kind of man who could pick up the phone and have the mayor of any major city on the line in minutes. It was his eye for people. And Daniel had been watching her. In the first week of the project, Isabella was flown first class to Singapore. Waiting for her on the desk was a thick folder. "You're in charge. Don't disappoint me." The design had to be bold enough to make headlines, but functional enough to operate as a luxury resort. Daniel didn't hover, but he checked in often. He pushed her when she hesitated, challenged her when she played it safe. Weeks turned into months. Another speculated, is Daniel Layton grooming a successor? Isabella ignored the gossip. She was too busy reclaiming the part of herself that had been buried under years of being Adrienne's wife. She made decisions worth millions without blinking. She negotiated with suppliers like she'd been born in a boardroom. And she realized something startling. She was good at this. Good in a way that made people take notice. "You've built something that's going to be talked about for the next decade." She smiled, unsure where he was going with this. "Not just as a designer, as a partner. That includes the coastal development we're breaking ground on next year." "Daniel, that's what you've earned," he cut in. "Don't look surprised. I told you I don't hand out favors. I invest in people who can deliver." It hit her then. She wasn't just rebuilding her career. The timing was poetic. From the outside, it looked like perfection. But Isabella had learned enough about image to know perfection was almost always a mask. Word is Carter's been having trouble closing that South Shore deal. One of them said. His wife's been trying to help, pushing her influencer brand, but investors aren't biting. He's got someone new handling design. Apparently, she's brilliant. The universe had a sense of humor after all. She didn't tell Daniel about the conversation. He didn't need the gossip. She wasn't just moving on. By the time the Singapore resort opened, an event covered by every major design publication, Isabella's name was synonymous with success. She gave interviews in tailored dresses, spoke on panels about sustainable luxury, and turned down offers from firms that once wouldn't have taken her call. And somewhere in the middle of all that, Daniel became more than a mentor. They never labeled it, but the connection was there, unspoken and undeniable. Of course you're going, he countered. Not to celebrate them, to remind them you exist. And that you're not just fine, you're better. She laughed, shaking her head. You make it sound like a chess match. It is, he said, his eyes glinting. And the best part, Adrian still didn't know the full truth. He didn't know she was now co-owner of one of Daniel's most profitable projects. He didn't know her designs had been chosen over his firm's for the South Shore deal. He didn't know she was wealthier now on her own than she had been in their entire marriage. He didn't know she'd already won. She started with the one thing Adrian could never touch, her mindset. She'd learned the hard way that appearance could be faked, titles could be stripped, and money could be lost. Her mornings began earlier now. She woke before sunrise, making tea in her quiet kitchen while the city outside was still stretching awake. Instead of scrolling through her phone for news about Adrian or avoiding it altogether, she read trade journals, architectural case studies, and global market reports. If she was going to play in Daniel's league, she needed more than talent. She needed to know the terrain. Prenatal yoga classes twice a week, swimming on Sundays, long walks through Central Park where she'd let herself think about the future without flinching. The changes were slow at first, but she noticed them. She replaced the mismatched thrift store couch with a sleek sectional in dove gray. For months after leaving Adrian, she'd clung to safe clothes, soft sweaters, loose dresses, anything that didn't demand attention. With Daniel's quiet encouragement and his assistant's impeccable connections, she rebuilt her closet from the ground up. Investors asked for her insight on projects she wasn't even working on. A magazine profile labeled her, the architect redefining luxury for the modern traveler. And with each appearance, her confidence grew. At a charity gala in London, she found herself seated at a table with a senior partner from Carter & Rowe, the very firm Adrian had fought to climb. The partner didn't recognize her at first. When Isabella finally mentioned her role in Daniel's latest coastal development, the man's fork paused midair. She smiled, a small, deliberate thing. I am. She didn't commit, but she let him see she was thinking about it because the truth was she'd learned the most powerful position in any negotiation was the one where you could say no. Her transformation reached its peak in the weeks before Adrienne's wedding. Daniel accompanied her to some, but often she went alone, knowing it was just as important for the world to see her as an independent force. And she knew without question that she would be there, not in the ballroom, but somewhere higher where the view was better. The Sterling Crown Terrace was booked under his name. She spent hours at a private salon, sipping herbal tea while stylists worked. A diamond bracelet encircled her wrist, a gift from Daniel with a note tucked inside the box. Tonight, you're the skyline. When she finally stepped in front of the mirror, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, but because she looked whole. But Isabella knew where the real story was. She was no longer the woman crying in a grocery store parking lot. No longer the shadow in the back of a photograph. Her transformation wasn't about revenge, though that would come. It was about proving something to herself, that she could be stripped of the life she thought she needed and still rise higher than she'd ever imagined. And as the first firework burst above her, she realized something else. The rooftop air shimmered with heat from the July evening. Every detail of the night had been planned. From the silver gown that caught every glint of terrace light to the guest list, power brokers, design columnists, and investors who shaped the city skyline. The guests below were tiny, moving in elegant patterns around the tables. The chandeliers glowed like captured suns. The music floated faintly upward through the glass, and at the center of it all, Adrian and Clarissa were playing their parts. But tonight, the script wasn't theirs. Daniel stood beside her, hands in his pockets, his easy stance belying the fact that every move tonight was calculated. She knew. Even the photographers who were supposed to be fixed on the bride and groom had started angling their cameras toward the rooftop. Isabella and Daniel stepped forward to the railing together, perfectly framed in the terrace's soft light. She stood tall, shoulders back, chin lifted just enough to say without words, "I'm not hiding." She watched his expression change in real time. Surprise, confusion, irritation. A ripple went through their crowd. Is that with Daniel Layton? The power of suggestion did the rest. The second blow was timed. Not just on the terrace, but through a discreet arrangement Isabella had secured earlier in the week. 30 seconds into the show, the same music began playing faintly through the Grand Atoria ballroom sound system. Daniel leaned closer, his voice just for her. Time for the final act. She nodded once. From the inside pocket of his suit, Daniel pulled a small envelope. Embossed in silver, it bore the Layton Developments crest. One of his assistants, waiting by the ballroom entrance, moved exactly on cue. She approached a well-known business columnist, one who'd been covering the Carter wedding like it was royal news, and handed him the envelope with a whispered, "From the hosts upstairs. Layton Developments is pleased to announce its latest coastal luxury project with lead design by award-winning architect Isabella Ross. The project, projected to generate record-breaking revenue, recently secured the South Shore development contract, previously pursued unsuccessfully by Carter and Rowe Financial." Within minutes, phones began buzzing around the ballroom. Adrienne's jaw tightened. The fireworks painted the sky in bursts of gold and crimson. The reception had been about Adrian and Clarissa's union, their image, their power. Now that spotlight was splitting, bleeding upward to the terrace where Isabella stood untouchable. Daniel, ever the tactician, gave the crowd one last image to remember. Cameras flashed from both levels. It was over in minutes, but the damage would last far longer. And she knew, without needing to see it, that Adrian and Clarissa were stewing in the knowledge that she hadn't just survived without them, she'd surpassed them. Daniel caught her eye from across the terrace, lifting his glass slightly in a silent toast. Isabella stood on the private terrace of her new home, a beautiful brownstone overlooking a quiet, tree-lined park. Daniel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around them both. "How are my girls doing?" he murmured, kissing the top of Isabella's head. The city skyline was visible in the distance, a reminder of the life she'd left and the one she'd built. But Isabella rarely thought of them anymore. Her world was here, in the warmth of Daniel's embrace and the gentle weight of her child in her arms. This was not a victory born of revenge. She was everything she was meant to be. If this story of rising from the ashes resonated with you, if you believe in the power of writing your own ending, then you're in the right place. We have many more stories to share about overcoming the impossible and finding the light on the other side. Join us on the journey.